So, this is Axiom of the Infinite Unknown, and I'm going to come up with something. Maybe I'll switch it up every time we do this. I am James, racist, stupid Valaitis, and you are...
That's inflammatory, man.
Anyway, go on.
Ciaran, the quarrelsome O Regan.
Cool, man. And we're basically just going to capture some, because we've both been thinking about existential crises, we've been thinking about freedoms. Obviously, they're all very relevant at the moment, and we want to just capture some preliminary thoughts, maybe just hash out our beginning thinking on the topic, and hopefully it will develop over time. Ciaran's gonna go out, and he's got a good amount of time with which he can think about it even longer and even more deeply. But we'll just sort of get some starting notes out there. So, you up for that, Ciaran?
100%, man.
Cool, man. So, where do you want to head first? Freedom of expression, or?
I think a simple one to start with is just what it is we mean by existential risk, because I think a lot of people might not be familiar with the phrase, or might not, or maybe if they have heard the phrase, that they're kind of sick of hearing it because it's been tossed around in a kind of nonchalant way a lot in the media. When it is used, it's often not used to describe things that maybe, I don't know, how would you put it? It's kind of used in a kind of throwaway manner, you know? So, I suppose what I mean by existential risk when I'm thinking of it is I like to think of a really simple way that Nick Bostrom has put it, which is essentially risks that threaten the permanent future of humanity, or that permanently threaten the future of humanity. So they very well could be an actual extinction of the human race, like nuclear holocaust, either that directly results in the extinction of humanity as a result of the actual nuclear fallout, or indirectly results in the extinction of humanity because of something like a nuclear winter and particulate matter going up above the clouds and ending up in the high atmosphere and blocking out the sun and results in cooling the planet and affects the ability for
plants. So we're talking. It's important to differentiate between catastrophic risk, which is to say that which maybe 5% of the population may survive, and full existential risk. And there is a it's not just a 5% difference between 5% of the population and 0% of the population. It's an infinite difference.
Yeah.
So that really, I think that's an important setup. Nick Bostrom is somebody who does a lot of work on this. I would recommend his Vulnerable World paper to anybody who's interested, and of course Toby Ord's got a book. But yeah, go for it.
A beautiful book. This one.
Yep.
Fucking lovely. But and also we could put the link to the Vulnerable World hypothesis into the show notes, because we can get the paper online. But to put it in perspective, so existential risk, as you said, James, it's like it could be 95% of the world get killed. It could be 1 billion people of the world. It's basically things that threaten the future of humanity. It could also be something that causes a collapse of civilization, where we essentially are forced to return to scavenging and figuring out how to survive without transport links, without it's the things that could result in like a Mad Max world, you know, where like civilization is gone, governments are gone. It's basically militias and
road warriors
that run the show, and that's if there are cars, you know, like we don't even know it's available. So existential risk, basically, and it could be civilizational collapse or human extinction, or enough human extinction that there's basically just an emphasis on survival rather than generating new innovations and generating new art, and all this stuff ends up just falling by the wayside. Anyway, so that's I suppose what we mean by it. But an interesting story or anecdote to start off with is something that I came across, just to put it in perspective at how likely this stuff is. That an episode of, sorry, not an episode, some kind of a lecture or a seminar that was given on published by Rebel Wisdom recently, was by Jamie Wheal and Douglas Rushkoff. And in it, Jamie Wheal highlighted something that Rushkoff had written an article about in the past, but I haven't had a chance to look it up yet, but I will be for this other thing that I'm writing, where Rushkoff essentially was hired by these very, very, very wealthy people to come and do a seminar. And then when he got to this place, Douglas Rushkoff, I'm not sure of his exact role, but he's an author and he's basically a philosopher and a tech kind of pioneer person.
I'm actually not a very big fan of him.
No?
No, I think it was something about his anarcho-syndicalism that turned me off. Anyway, go on.
Yeah, it's my first time encountering him,
Mm-hmm.
and I found this. So I know he was on Rebel Wisdom before once, I think at least, but I don't know anything about the man. But he had a really interesting anecdote story where he was basically hired by these very wealthy people to come and do a seminar. So when he got to this place, and he doesn't normally do it, he said, but he did it because what he was getting paid to do this was more than half his yearly salary at his professor job. So he was like, all right, I don't normally do this, but the money is so absurd, I will.
Fair enough.
So it's just so ridiculous. So then he showed up at this place, and he was led into this room that he thought, oh, this is the green room where I'm going to get a chance to relax and chill out before I go and give the lecture to this room of people, you know. And then after a little while, 5 men walked into the room and shook his hand and sat down. And he was like, what's going on? And they said, oh, we're ready to start. And it was those 5 men that had hired him and paid him that money. And he said that they initially started off asking him questions about Bitcoin and technocurrencies. And then they got to the spicy stuff after a while. Basically what he thought, if I remember correctly, what he thought that they were at, once they started asking the questions, he's like, oh, that's why I'm here. And they started asking him things like, a question that stood out to me was, they were wondering how it was, what were the best way of maintaining control over their security force when the event happens. And the event to them, they didn't even need to stipulate what it was, because there's like so many ways that civilization could collapse. They're just not,
which are human made.
Yeah, the most dangerous ones are the human made ones, yeah. And there's so many ways at which, well, the more, not more dangerous, but the more likely, probabilistically, are the human made ones. Yeah, so like there's definitely dangerous ones, like the space rock, like the one that took out the dinosaurs would be pretty unpleasant and inconvenient. but so basically, but they were wondering, like, okay, when the event happens, which is basically the collapse of civilization and existential crises, how do I maintain power or maintain control over my security force? Because they're like, they have these private militias, essentially, of mercenaries. And they're like, well, how do I stop these boys from taking my tins of beans? Because they no longer need money, like, because they can't buy anything because civilization is gone. So money doesn't mean anything. And how do you stop a team of 20 or 30 Jocko Willings from taking your tins of fish and your beans and your bags of rice? So like that's the level of thinking. These billionaires, like, these are billionaires who were genuinely thinking, like, how do I keep control over a team of probably ex-special force lads and stop them from having a mutiny and taking my shit when civilization...
Yeah, how do you incentivize people not to turn on you?
Yeah. So Douglas Rushkoff was kind of like shocked, and then the penny dropped that, oh, that's why I'm here, basically, to answer questions like this. And he was just like, well, first of all, be nice to them and treat them like family. But the ideal scenario, he said, is how about using your resources so that the event doesn't happen? And they looked at him like he had 2 fucking heads. Like he was like, all of a sudden he just turned purple and started floating or levitating or something. So like, you know, he said that they couldn't believe. They said that they just kind of looked at him like he was naive. Like, what are you talking about? It's going to happen. Like, and these are the 5 billionaires. And so this sounds like, these existential risk things sound so
Abstract.
abstract and insane. But like when you just look at the amount of near misses that were had with things like nuclear weaponry, like near misses by like there was one guy called
Command and Control is a good book on exactly this.
Is it? I've never read that.
Oh, well, they have a documentary as well, which is on
Command and
Netflix if
Control.
you'd like to watch it.
Let me make
Yeah.
a note of that. Did they mention your man Stanislav Petrov?
Is that the guy in the? Is that the guy who said hold off?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The 1983. There was the screen, the radar started flashing. A Russian colonel, lieutenant colonel. The screen started flashing. 5 incoming missiles coming from the west, and they double checked it. Yeah, 5 incoming missiles, and he's like, "Do you know what? I don't think that because our machine's broken." Because his job was supposed to be when there's incoming missiles, ring the Kremlin. They push the button, Holocaust. But he was like, no, this isn't right. And he held off, and it turned out the machine was broken. But the reason he held off is because he was calm enough and cool enough to go, do you know what? This isn't a nuclear attack because they're only firing 5. And if they were going to go for us, our screen would be full of dots.
Yeah, and they just had a meet. Gorbachev had just had a meeting.
Yeah.
So, like with the US, so it just didn't make sense. The context made no sense.
Yeah.
And he had the sensibility to go, this actually doesn't make sense for multiple reasons.
And think about how calm and cool that does. But we don't really. Part of me is like the reason that we don't know about him so much in the West, and he's not as famous as he should be, is because he's Russian, and because there was probably efforts to did not make any Russians look heroic. Do you know?
But it's also the Taleb story of the janitor who failed. Yeah, no. So it's exactly that. It's basically the janitor who sees that there might be a problem, ignores it, and then saves the children from the resultant fire, versus the janitor who sees there might be a problem, fixes it before anybody even knows about it, and then he's the unsung hero because there was no catastrophe to be diverted. So, subverted. Yeah, so that's the if there was,
and there's been loads of them. That's only one story. There's been loads of them. That's what's so mental about it.
Somebody dropping a spanner while working on it.
Yeah,
and then
they accidentally dropped one out of a plane in New Mexico. They dropped a nuke out of a plane by accident while it was flying. They dropped it.
So many.
Yeah. So I cut you off there. Sorry, I got a bit excited. I had a lot of caffeine today.
Oh no, dude! I don't think I was saying anything particularly, crucial. I was just sort of riffing off what you were saying. I think you made some interesting points about the event, and the vulnerable world hypothesis splits. It more looks at technological innovation and certain tech. So thus far, we've been actually very lucky. The technologies we've created are those that are either incapable of destroying whole towns, and those that are capable of such devastation are difficult to manufacture and create. And we haven't yet discovered the equivalent of a nuclear bomb that you can make at home in 10 minutes.
Not yet.
There's nothing to say that that's impossible.
Yeah, because it is possible. By the laws of physics, it is, but not yet. But it's only a matter of time before it is with innovation.
Yeah. And so eventually somebody will discover a technology, and Nick Bostrom defines them as type 1, which are the easy nukes we were just talking about, the potential technologies that somebody may be able to make in their back garden with ingredients you can get off of Amazon. There are type 2A, which are like the technologies that incentivize superpowers to do a first strike sort of instance. So if you have a type 2A vulnerability, It's some level of technology at which powerful actors have the ability to produce civilization devastating harms. And we would be left in what Nick Bostrom calls a semi-anarchic default condition. So that's to say, going back to sort of what we were talking about with the road warrior world. we barely scrape through.
Yeah.
But we don't want to be like, we won't be, needless to say, we won't be there like, oh, we got lucky. That won't be the thought if we're in that world.
Yeah.
So,
if anything, the people that are left behind will be the unlucky ones, maybe.
Yeah. That's the type 2A we're talking about. Type 2B is effectively, it's basically a negative externality. So imagine global warming. I think this is the example he uses. Global warming, but even worse. Imagine a situation where it's in everybody's interest to do a certain thing, in their personal interest and let's say their local interest, so their family benefit from this thing. But in the aggregate, it destroys the world. How do you stop that technology from being used? And then you've got type 0, which is a technology that has like a hidden risk. And if it's discovered, it's just like immediate devastation. Say, what's an example?
Like an example would be like the worries. There was legitimate worries, I'm pretty sure, when they started first using the Large Hadron Collider in case they made a black hole.
Yeah.
Like they were like,
yeah. So basically, a side effect.
Yeah.
Exactly that. A side effect situation in which, the side effect is everyone dies.
Yeah, they were like this, pushing the button. They were like squinting and crossing their fingers. They were like, let's not have a black hole.
So you've got all of these different types, and that's just technology, like man-made technology. And then you've got all of the other ways in which we could be destroying ourselves. And so that's Nick Bostrom's paper in very brief summary. I think everybody should read it. But I think a lot about that and his divisions, his categorizations. I quite like his taxonomy of the technological risks. So you've got that, and then of course you've got everything that we've. You know what? I was thinking about Yuval Noah Harari, because obviously he talks about this. He really, he's a genius. We both agree, but he really missed. He was blind to biohazards, wasn't he? He doesn't really touch them at all in his writing. He was quite, because biohazards are massive. Like the ability of somebody in a lab to invent smallpox again and kill, 90% of the world.
Toby Ord mentioned that yesterday in the podcast.
He was pretty blind to that. He was blind to pandemic situations, really. He just doesn't talk. He didn't focus. For as much as he talked about nuclear war, I think that should have been a more encompassing topic.
Just WMD, just weapons of mass destruction, which would include nuclear weapons and
I think he would have benefited from that.
Yeah, because in his books, he does what he does a fantastic job of, especially in 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. He does a fantastic job of showing second and third and fourth order effects that come off the back of the big three of climate change, technological disruption, and nuclear warfare, and how they can lead to each other and how they interact and how they're all these global issues. But like you said, he doesn't really. I wonder what that bias was, because even in podcasts since, I've heard him on Sam Harris and some other podcasts during this pandemic period, and he hasn't really even talked about it. But then when I hear like Toby Ord yesterday and Sam Harris on that new podcast talking about this particular...
On the Making Sense with Sam Harris podcast.
And they're talking about this particular strain of H1 that they were able to make that at 60%.
Exactly. Stuff in there I didn't even realise.
60%.
I hadn't heard of this. Yeah, incredible. Yeah, so these subsequent order effects, as you say, Yuval Noah Harari was live to iatrogenics, but he was
Being what's that? Well, how do you what?
iatrogenics.
Yeah.
So iatrogenics it's usually used in medicine, but it's been since extrapolated and generalized to be used elsewhere. Basically, negative subsequent order effects. So an iatrogenic effect of prescribing somebody a certain medication would be that perhaps this medication raises their risk of heart failure by 1%. And so these are the sort of, negative externalities of things. So basically negative subsequent order effects. And like I was saying, whilst he's aware of that in his writing, it's just impressively absent, isn't it? Like,
Well, especially given this context with the pandemic.
yeah, he's just, because you can't expect somebody to be looking at everything. But I did note it, like, because there are certain things Taleb is blind to as well. That I when I was reading the book, I was like, that's because people, they can't be on top of every single issue, can they?
And maybe he
That's
was
why we
just,
have multiple people.
yeah. And I think also, I think the three that he does focus on are the three that have the biggest probability of, given current available evidence, like the biggest probability of disaster.
I would rank biohazard above nuclear now.
Would
With
you?
with CRISPR and everything.
Yeah.
I really think that changes the equation a little bit.
Because it's so much easier to make.
Yeah, I do think so.
There was a section in that the Precipice book where he quotes the power of the weapons now, and one of the I may have misread this, but I'm pretty sure a section that I read basically said that one of the modern thermonuclear weapons has more explosive capacity than every single bomb used by all the militaries in the entire Second World War combined at the same time.
That's incredible.
Yeah, like that's absolutely
What an incredible fact.
Yeah, it's just that was like, what the fuck?
Yeah, I think so. I think the problem with that is states. The reason why I don't weight them above bioweapons is because states are in control of nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
Bioweapons are becoming accessible to you if you wanted to manufacture one.
Yeah.
Chemist. Like nuclear weapons, they aren't scaling so fast in their ease of manufacturability, such that in 5 years you'll be able to make a nuclear bomb. But in 5 years, I think you'll be able to make a devastating bioweapon, and that's scary.
Yeah, there's you end up like Breaking Bad, a load of smallpox inside in a container.
Yeah,
used to be like Breaking Bad, and you'd have your little trailer and just making smallpox, and But this is I just happened to open it on the exact page. It's convenient.
Perfect.
The quote goes like this. It's from page 23. Nuclear weapons were a discontinuous change in human power. At Hiroshima, a single bomb did the damage of thousands. And 6 years later, a single thermonuclear bomb held more energy than every single explosive used in the entire course of the Second World War.
Bloody hell.
What the fuck would you even do with one of them? Like, what do you do?
Yeah, I know. Like,
you do with that?
It really is a matter of. This is how I was thinking about Jeff, because Jeff Bezos is looking
What's the
at
point?
Jeff Bezos is looking at becoming the first ever person to be valued themselves at $1 trillion. Yeah, and I had the same question. I was like, what are you gonna do with that? Like, wait, are you gonna buy 5 football teams and then then fight them against each other and pay 4 of them to lose and 1 of them to win. Like, what can you do with $1 trillion? You're going to buy Brazil and then make it Bezos, and the whole country is just called Bezos, and it's all supplied by Amazon. Like, you could buy a continent if you have $1 trillion, like maybe Antarctica. But it's mental. Like, I think the same thing about there are a few things in the world where sometimes it goes so far that you think it lost its point. Money's point is for freedom, like to be able to have the freedom to live the way you want to live. And the weapons point is to, deter other people. At the point at which you could blow up the world, but now you can blow up the world 10 times over, that it doesn't scale. People don't get more scared.
Yeah.
Now the world's going to be super blown up. It was already going to be blown up. It's like, it's so crazy.
Yeah, even to figure out what to even like with something like that, is the objective, like would that even only be useful if you had like an Armageddon situation, like the Armageddon movie, where you just flew fucking Bruce Willis and Ben Affleck up there to stick them into a big space rock, It's like, is that what the fuck? Because what would you even do with that? Like, what do you do
on Mars all at once?
Yeah,
you could just go, I don't like the way Mars looked, and just wipe off half of Mars.
Yeah.
Go, now let's rebuild it.
Yeah, Mars would end up looking like an apple that you're taking a chunk out of.
Yeah.
And
in it you'd situate a biodome. That's what it's useful for.
Yeah, it's so ridiculous, man. So like you have shit like that, and then I'm wondering, like, well, China probably has some of them, and it wouldn't surprise me if they fucking do. And
man, that's worth saying as well. We both recently listened to Jimmy Lay on the Uncommon Knowledge podcast.
Yeah.
And that is sick.
Yeah.
People will know if they've watched any of our other videos. We're quite interested in China. But that was, as we called it, hardcore confirmation bias.
Yeah.
Like, he is a legend. And it's sort of piecing that back and feeding it into what we're talking about. I see China as possibly its own catastrophic risk.
Yeah.
I think the way in which people don't realize, there's a way in which the world operates, the global politics of which has been sort of directed, governed largely by the US and almost entirely by the Western world combined. Like, you're talking about, the WHO, the UN, all of these things. Yeah. All of these things
World Bank
set up by the World Bank, by Western countries with Western philosophies. And if we're facing a situation in which Trump gets another 4 years, Hong Kong is subsumed properly into China, China just carry on ignoring world politics, and the US loses its position on the world stage, we're looking at a world in which the largest superpower is a country with not much respect, zero respect for the liberties we care about. And they will tear down the institutions. This isn't hyperbole. Of course they will. The institutions were set up by philosophies that are antithetical to their values. They will tear them down, rebuild them in their vision, and we will be living in a very different world. And for me, that's a true catastrophic risk. So that is also worth throwing in there. Politics, unfortunately, you can't escape it.
No, but that's an example of existential risk, because I think when I think about existential risk, I don't just think about, which I didn't mention at the start, but I don't just think about the destruction of humanity, the collapse of civilization. I think about the potential for a fucking Brave New World or 1984. as
Okay.
well. So
So
that
the existence of humans and their pairing of liberties as well, this
yeah,
Enlightenment thinking,
yeah,
these values born of the Enlightenment thinkers,
yeah,
like so. Yeah, humanitarianism and humans
yeah,
combined,
yeah,
and you can't have one without the other. Humans without humanity are just apes,
yeah,
and humanity without humans can't possibly be acted upon.
yeah.
So yeah, no, okay,
Think
that's
because think about it in terms
what I'm
of
saying.
the ability to have the freedom to produce whatever art you want, to have whatever conversation you want, to voice your opinion, to watch any movie, to read any book. Doesn't matter how heinous, doesn't matter how fucked up, doesn't matter. And then who gets to decide what is heinous and what is fucked up? So like like if I think about the Enlightenment, if I use a David Deutsch definition from the beginning of Infinity, which you said you're after starting, he uses the definition of the West, where he basically describes the West as the society that developed since the Enlightenment based on the values of science, reason, and freedom.
Yeah,
That's how I think
yeah,
of the West.
yeah. So like you say, I'm reading it at the moment, and I've just been reading about because he's talking about basically what happened where humans we haven't not cared about progression. We haven't not cared about living in a better world. We cared, but we just couldn't get it to happen. And so what occurred wherein suddenly we could actually start making the progress? And he very much tracks it back, doesn't he, to
Yeah.
the Enlightenment and effectively one of the most important things about the Enlightenment was
The abandonment of higher authorities as purveyors of truth and providers of realities of the world. Yeah,
yeah,
the search for better explanations as an individual and our ability to seek truth independent of what we're being told by a monarch or an institute or a church or whatever.
yeah, exactly that. Yeah, a rejection of authority
Mm,
and of and an installment of the tradition of criticism
yeah,
and falsifiability.
yeah,
Very Popperian. That obviously comes later with Popper. Up until then, it's more empiricism, as
yeah,
he says, inductivism. But yeah, no, it's that fallibilism of we might be wrong.
yeah.
That's
That's
what this
it.
podcast is.
Yeah, precisely, precisely. It's the switch that was flipped
Yeah,
was individuals in the Enlightenment abandoning these religious authorities and monarchs and everything, and instead saying, "How about we?" Essentially, if I was to describe it in my own words, it's how about we approach the world from a place of humility, assuming that we're wrong, rather than approach the
yeah.
world from a place of arrogance, assuming that we're right.
Yeah, and you
And
know, as biased humans, we won't always assume. You can't hold an opinion. You can't hold every opinion assuming that you're wrong about everything, because you also have to function.
yeah,
But that's where the tradition of criticism comes in, where you can hold an opinion, and it's not contingent on just you to recognize you might be wrong. I can take some of that load off of you by saying you're wrong.
yeah,
And if we
yeah.
instill a culture of you have respect for the fact that I say you're wrong, that's where that's where the falsifiability can come in, and the axiom of the infinite unknown
Yeah.
can be realized.
But I think this is the perfect transition into the other thing we wanted to talk about, which is because this has been bugging me a lot, which is those the reason I'm familiar with that definition is because I was reading that chat parts of the beginning of Infinity again recently, and the things that are being attacked in the West at the moment as a result of this situation in America and the kind of this insidious, sludgy creep of postmodern critical theory under the guise of compassion and virtue are the very things that allowed us to be even able to develop the technology to be able to have this conversation. the ability to be able to develop the social technology for us to be able to have free and open discussion. Those are science, reason, and freedom. And those things are under attack because reason doesn't come into play when it comes to critical theory because it's inherently unreasonable.
Yeah.
And freedom is irrelevant to them because to them they're coming at it from a fundamental religious grounding of the West is inherently broken, inherently flawed, patriarchal, oppressive tyranny and needs to be torn down with utopia built from the ashes. And science is the absolute enemy of the critical theory because it works and because it actually gives us the best method we have of investigating the workings of nature.
Yeah, no, so postmodernism, if you were to want to distill the point of it that is crucial to what we're talking about now, because it's multipolar in its concerns. The important part for what we're talking about is the fact that it sees objectivity itself as an ideology. And in that sense...
It sounds so ridiculous to even...
No, exactly. And in that sense, their insistence that there is no truth is a truth claim that makes the whole thing self-defeating prima facie. It's just...
And then they write books and use logic to try and take apart logic, which is inherently in itself self-defeating. Because they're trying to use logic to deconstruct logic.
Yeah.
You know, like it's so ridiculous. And then this ideology essentially looks at the world, dissolves all these what they call meta-narratives, postmodernism, and then applied postmodernism is essentially, well, if we dissolve all these meta-narratives like religions and even objectivity itself, science itself then you dissolve all those basically, well, apparently they think that they do. And then if you look across society, what you're left with after you dissolve all the narratives is essentially just power differentials between groups. And part of the narrative that gets dissolved is nature as it relates to human differences.
Yeah.
Because it rejects science, it rejects nature, which then rejects inherited traits, which then rejects the idea of nature playing a role in differences between people, differences between places. It just basically goes, nurture is all that matters, which feeds into their ideology based on building...
Yeah, the tabula rasa, the blank slate approach.
Yeah. But that fits into the Marxist ideology, basically, because this applied postmodern critical theory is essentially Marxism with a wig on and a fake pair of glasses.
Yeah, my friend, because I have a friend who's very much into like analyzing, criticizing postmodernism, and he basically sort of he divided it into 3 stages: the high deconstructive classical postmodernism, which is to say your originals,
Derrida, Jacques Lacan.
Yeah. And then applied with like Michael Foucault, and Judith, and then you have reified postmodernism, which is sort of what we're seeing now, where it just compounds in on itself, and it reifies its very existence as a philosophy. So that's how he and he also describes it as this. How does he say it? But basically, he, like you were saying, he says it has this Marxian core to it, but you switch out class with identity traits.
Yeah.
And you act as though it functions similarly, even though it functions very differently when you make that change.
Yeah, there's actually there's a section here on Douglas Murray, The Madness of Crowds. So like as a starting point, basically, for anyone who sees this who's not that familiar with Marxism, like just to steelman Marx, like I've read, from what I've read of him, he legitimately was a genius. He just, like all of us, had particular biases. And obviously he didn't have the 2020 retrospect that we have to see what the downstream effects of enforced equality of outcome would lead to. You know, he didn't get to see Red Guards eating their children in Maoist China, or Stalinist Holodomor where people cannibalize themselves in Ukraine.
Or even just Chinese concentration camps.
Yeah, yeah.
Like even something as benign as that's still happening.
Yeah, so like this he didn't, and so he viewed the world basically from this power differential situation. And I won't go in, that's a different podcast, but his biases were basically set up to it was in his interest to be able to run with this basically because he himself had gotten involved with kind of radical socialist kind of ideas, obviously, but then that affected his ability to get a job in a university, and then he was out, and then he was poor, and then he had this mate, Engels, who was able to support him and all this stuff, and he was so broke at certain points, Marx was, that he couldn't even afford to bring his sick wife to the hospital or sick kids to the doctor, and couldn't put food on the table and everything. And then he had a lot of understandable, I suppose. You can see how it was he was bitter or angry against people, the bourgeoisie, the middle class, and the business owners and the capitalists, because he himself had suffered financially so great, even though he himself was a very, very intelligent individual who I'm sure had a lot of resentment as a result of being so smart, but not being able to provide for his family. So these are really simple biases that I can see, oh yeah, this understandable how he had resentment, Not that I'm saying it's justified the way that he thought about things, because he basically used inductive reasoning and narrative fallacy to then look back through history and say, essentially, he looked back through history with this lens of finding examples of poor people.
Yeah, this post hoc rationalization.
Yeah, and fit this narrative. So then postmodernism, applied postmodernism, and the way kind of with critical theory essentially does the same thing, is that it switched out. Instead of having the bourgeoisie, capitalist business owner, middle class people, whip them out and put in white cis male patriarchy, and then instead of the proletariat, it's basically anyone who's not white cis male. So
exactly. So it's important to say postmodernism itself is so disparate that it couldn't possibly function as a worldview unless you had this core to it, this Marxian core, with which you switch out class, and you have this victimhood oppression narrative, and that's the thing around which now you can build a movement. If you have victims and you have oppressors, now you have something that functions in a self-perpetuating manner. Otherwise, it's just it's Foucault over here talking about power and justice, power and knowledge. You have Judith Butler over here talking about feminist issues. You have Kimberly Crenshaw over here talking about intersectionality, and they don't meet unless you say there's a through line with this, and it's a victimhood oppression narrative, and now that serves as this Marxian core, basically. I think, and
in that sense as well, it's like a way of thinking about postmodernism is that just as without any of the other let's say Marxist ideas put in, is that it's basically just like a solvent. It doesn't solve problems; it only creates them and melts and tries to melt stuff. It doesn't. It's not a value system in itself. It's just a means. It's just a toolkit.
It's deconstructed.
That's it. It doesn't. But it doesn't build anything. It doesn't construct anything. No. So it's inherently vacuous.
That's why it's called critical theory. It's just literally criticizing and dismantling things.
And a big part of it, what makes this stuff so religious, is that it has rapture-based thinking, like Second Coming of Christ stuff.
Yeah.
Where essentially it goes, when fucking patriarchy is taken apart and when Western civilization is dismantled because of this inherent, apparent, according to them, inherent inbuilt white supremacy because of things like colonialism. So then they're like, well, the whole West is fucked because white people in the past have done fucked up shit. Even though the only reason they're even able to write those books that criticize the West is because they live in the West. and not in Saudi Arabia or China or
Exactly.
any other country that is basically dictatorship and doesn't have science, reason, and freedom as the fundamental values at the basis of the structure of society for a liberal democracy to even function. And basically, like, there's actually a section here from so this is a section from The Madness of Crowds. I took a photo of it when I was talking to my friend recently about this very thing. So there's a chapter in The Madness of Crowds called, it's something along the lines of the Marxist foundations, and it's one of the interlude sections between two chapters.
Yeah.
And so it basically, this is an example. Although Leclau, so there's two writers, Leclau and Mouffe, who wrote a book called Hegemony and Socialist Strategy. And basically, here we go. This is a quote from it. The conditions of political struggle in mature capitalism are increasingly distant from the 19th century model. Political struggle, and then the close quote. And then Murray goes on to write, political struggle in this era must involve other groups. And then he cuts down to another bit below. So basically what it describes is, although Leclau and Mouffe are distinctly vague about a whole array of conclusions, one thing they are clear about is the utility for the socialist struggle of, quote, new social movements, close quote, such as the women's movement. The utility of such groups is obvious. They're, quote, highly diverse struggles, urban, ecological, anti-authoritarian, anti-institutional, feminist, anti-racist, ethnic, regional, or that of sexual minorities, close quote, give purpose and drive to the socialist movement that needs new energy. What is more, unless they cohere together, these groups might just pursue their own agendas and their own needs. What is needed is to bring all these movements under one umbrella, the umbrella of the socialist struggle.
Yeah. Yeah, no.
And
that captures it so well.
Yeah. And that's that book itself is fantastic. Anyone interested in any of this stuff, even if they were to buy that book and just given the context, read that chapter, that Marxist interlude one, and also the race chapter. And even if people just read the two of them and none of the rest of the book, they'll be well equipped to have an understanding of some of the reasoning and the arguments that are being thrown around at the moment.
Yeah, the chapters stand alone.
They're separate essays.
Yeah, because as you say, they are separate essays. Women, race, sexuality or gay, trans, and then obviously the interludes on technology and Marxism.
Yeah. And I think and I think that's what not a lot of people realize, like, because it's so hard to disentangle this stuff. It's so hard to, like, we've been aware of this shit for a long time. So for us, we're seeing stuff now and we're like, oh yeah, this and this and this, and we can see it because we've been watching this shit for years. Whereas for someone who's new to this and has just living a normal life and hasn't had exposure to these ideas, I can understand how it's totally perplexing to go, why the fuck are James and Ciaran criticizing these people that just want social justice?
Yeah.
It's totally understandable why people will be even distraught or confused or angry at someone like myself or yourself, because we're the ones that are criticizing the seemingly virtuous and compassionate. And then mixed in amongst that group are genuinely virtuous and compassionate people who don't realize that they're giving momentum to a train where the drivers that are driving the train want to crash the train into the station.
Yeah.
So like they're looking at, because the station is Western civilization. So like they're like, the more people that get on board the social justice train, they don't realize that the social justice warriors that are driving it, the minority of people that are actually interested in this kind of ideology and understand it, they're genuinely trying to dismantle Western Enlightenment values, the very things that even allow them to protest in the first place.
Let's be honest, their branding is brilliant.
Fantastic.
Like social justice. So anybody who stands against it is for social injustice.
Yeah.
Wow, you've really nailed it.
What do you mean you're against anti-racism?
Yeah, Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
So what, you don't think they matter? Wow, you're really racist. It's like, No, maybe it's the part in the Black Lives Matter website where it says explicitly we want to demolish nuclear families. Like maybe maybe that one is a bit of a problem, or maybe
Yeah.
the fact it's built on a lie, or maybe the fact it reifies race, which people might have an understanding by this point that I think race is, as I said before, race makes intelligent people stupid. It is so toxic. The very concept of it. It was built to justify, because before the Western world became heavily involved in transatlantic slavery, it was just taken for granted that that's what you did. Slaves were just a thing that, it's a functioning economy. You have workers, you have slaves, you have slave owners. Like, this was the way the world was up until very recently. And it was only the Western world that decided we need to justify to ourselves how we can take these people as slaves when we
Yeah.
know actually that we want people to generally be free. So they say, well, these people are different because skin color, race. Let's say they're of a different race. They're not of the human race, they're of a black race. And we're of a white race. And so that justifies slavery. That's how we get the thing now that people are protesting, I'm proud to be black. It's like you shouldn't even, that's like saying, that's like being put on, a football team called the others, and then saying I'm proud to be a member of the others. Years after it became relevant, and people stopped using it to like pick on you and say that you were discriminated against. I just don't see the point in clinging on to it when all it does now is justify so much upset and suffering. And so I every time I think about it, I honestly don't see a world in which we had two worlds, one in which they completely abandon race and the other in which they don't. I don't see how this one's not far better than that one.
Yeah.
And you've got France who don't even measure it. So in their statistics, they don't even track race. If there's a murder, there's a murder. And they know if it was a man or a woman, but they don't know the skin color of the victim because it's not important to them. And guess what? They function fine, better than fine. Like they function quite well, especially when you compare it to the turmoil that you're getting in America and by proxy England. And
Yeah.
I just,
Like Sam Harris put it very well in that latest podcast he did, or the second to latest podcast he did, talking
oh, the
about
hair color.
situation. Yeah, he's
Yeah, I
like
think that's a perfect way to put it.
brilliant. Like whereas like that whole podcast is worth listening to for anyone who's able to go, because Harris basically gives a big, like, he basically goes into a lot of 2 hours expanding on points that me and James talked about
In the last
in our last
episode.
podcast. We did number 6, but it's twice as long, his one, and he goes deeper into a lot of different, into the same areas.
So worth listening to.
Yeah, but he puts it very simple. He's like, how do we move to a place where your skin color becomes just as important as your hair color if we keep making skin color the most important topic in the room? So like, if we keep bringing it up and keep putting importance on it, how do we make it unimportant? Because like Martin Luther King said in the 60s, like, he wants his kid to be able to grow up in a world where the content of their character is more important than the color of their skin. And this is in the fucking 60s, and it's just like, I watched a documentary recently, the 13th, because I've been trying to falsify my opinion. I've been specifically trying to find out where I'm wrong, and
Yeah.
that
I listened to the
documentary.
New York Times for that reason.
Yeah. And the 13th, I'll be interested to hear what you think it is, because I might have to leave then after that, and I have to kind of get out of here in the next 10 minutes. But the 13th, what I thought about that documentary was, it did a really good job. And also, I watched the new Spike Lee movie called Da 5 Bloods on Netflix as well. That kind of shows
Oh, I
treatment
haven't
of
seen that.
American. Yeah, it's good. It's good, but it's just it's interesting. It's like really pro the Viet Cong in
Really?
a lot of parts. Yeah, because
All right.
it's about the mistreatment of African Americans in the Civil War, and basically the way that they were treated when they went home, and the way that they was 30% of the soldiers were African American, even though they only made up whatever 10 or 12% of the population. So it goes into that stuff, but then it's like shines a really good light on the Viet Cong as being like these, but anyway. So I watched that, and then I also the 13th, and I've been reading a lot of stuff that's outside of my typical sources, let's say, right? And chatting to friends of mine in the UK, in the US as well, who are all about this Black Lives Matter movement. So I'm trying to figure out where they're coming from and where I'm wrong. And but it was the 13th, the documentary. What I thought was interesting was the art. First of all, they did I thought it was really interesting, and I genuinely was horrified to see videos and clips of lynchings and the hangings and all this fucked up shit that went on in the South. That are like, oh yeah, I can see why people are really upset by these. This is their heritage, and then also, but then at the same time, I can go, okay, like we've talked about before, that layer step back and go, okay, but I need to take this in the context of everything else. They can't just let anecdote judge my interpretation of the world, So then going from there to, all right, but I thought then they did a really good job of showing the history and all the fucking horrific shit that went on. And then there was a certain kind of bait and switch at some point. So there was a certain point in the documentary, it seemed, where I'll happy to rewatch it if I was wrong, but I'm interested to hear what you think it is. That there was like a bait and switch where it went from black people are getting fucked over to black people are still getting fucked over now, but their laws and everything aren't the same. So it's poor people that are getting fucked over, not just black people. But they
Yeah.
don't acknowledge that they don't explicitly acknowledge that it's okay. Now it's poor people that are getting fucked over, but it's a disproportionate amount of black poor people.
Yeah.
Instead, it's black people are getting fucked over, and then they're still getting fucked over. But it's like, but what's going on that's leading to this? Because the race.
Yeah. So I would say just because I know you need to go. I would say that first of all, so for anybody who doesn't know, the 13th it's on Netflix, isn't it? And
Yeah.
it's based on, well, the title is it's nominally about the 13th Amendment,
Yeah.
and which abolished slavery and involuntary servitude.
Really well
Uh,
made, like.
yeah, but then it from what I remember, it also includes sort of takes it up through Jim Crow laws, and so there is a problem because it is indubitably true that this group that has been sectioned together and called the Black people, they were forced into this group, and as such they developed a culture around this shared characteristic. And so I understand what Black culture was. I don't think it exists anymore. I don't think hip hop is a Black culture unless you call me Black, because I'm repping RTJ. I love hip hop. You've got people who love anything that would have been stereotypically Black is now shared by many different skin colors. So Black culture is a thing that I see as having been forced to exist, having given us a lot of good things, and now we're in a position where actually we need group ourselves around this Blackness, or it needs to become a far more flexible term that includes me and somebody who plays basketball who's also white. But to get back to the sort of the point of this bait and switch, Black people with redlining, with genuine Jim Crow laws, have been systematically screwed in history. And now we are looking at this aftermath of economic devastation where, for whatever reason, these people weren't able to escape the hole in which they were pushed into. unlike, you know, the Jews or the Koreans or the Japanese after the internment camps, this culture was unable to do the work itself. But I don't believe that that means it's unable to do the work itself now. I don't see it as they're now reliant. Amy Wax has a brilliant parable. I'll say it quickly. Basically, imagine a guy, he's gone on a walk, he's been hit by a car. You can say the car was driven by Bill Gates, yeah? And now he's crippled and he's got 5 years of rehab ahead of him. And Bill Gates is saying, I want to give you all of the money in the world to make you better. But he's got 5 years of rehab ahead of him. And he knows he's going to be waking up every day for 5 years, having to work his ass off. He can either lay in the hospital bed, feel sorry for himself and say life's unfair, or he can do the hard, he can acknowledge it's unfair, but he has to do the hard work himself. Nobody can do it for him. I feel that way about many of the situations we're seeing where culturally there needs to be shift in some of these neighborhoods, which are predominantly darker skinned people, but also inhabited by light skinned people. And there needs to be a shift in the mentality of, now how do I get myself out of here? So it's true that they could have found themselves here because of because of pure racism. It could be the case, I don't believe so, but it could be the case that 100% of this is because of racism leading up to the 80s. I still don't think that that means you're relying on other people to help you out of it. I think you do need to look at what you can do. Like, I don't like saying it, but, you know, start with not killing one another and sort of accumulating wealth, and get rid of these concepts of, if somebody's reading, they're acting white. And, you know,
guys to look up on this, because I'm kind of relatively new to this avenue, but guys that that you've introduced me to, John McWhorter and Glenn Lowry, their discussions on this are fascinating, because they'll have heated debates where they'll go back and forth, and Glenn Lowry will be more around the kind of moral avenue and looking at it from a kind of a Christian moral sense, and then John McWhorter will be coming at it from an economic perspective, and they go back and forth. And then other guys would be Coleman Hughes and, of course, Thomas Sowell. Isn't there like a seminal book on this, which I haven't read, but I had it recommended to me, is Black Rednecks, White Liberals.
Yeah, no, so I haven't read that yet either.
Yeah.
But yeah,
We should read that and do a podcast on it. We should figure a few weeks on the line, like at some point in August or something, because I'm going to be taking a break for the month of July and going to finishing this other thing. But Coleman,
yeah,
and it just, we can have a chat about it. Coleman Hughes, he did a part 2 of a discussion with Rubin on the Rubin report, called the myths of economic disparities, or something like that, or something, the myths of systemic racism, or something like that, where basically Coleman Hughes talks about, and I must actually try and find this research, because I don't like, I'm same as you, like, on the one hand, it could be 100% racism that's leading to this, but either way, the solution is not to kill each other. Even if it's 100% systemic racism, that's the reason for there being this massive economic disparity, and the reason that the median income of an African or black family in America is $17,000, whereas the median income of a white family, or median net worth of a white family, is 100.
Yeah, no, it's important to say, the worth, the wealth,
net worth, That net worth of black family,
the wealth gap,
$17,000, white family 170. Median income. There were stats that Sam Harris put in. Like, that's mental. That's bananas. But even if the reality is that's 100%, then the solution is not let's have loads of crime and murder. Like, so that then if it is a load of racism, then I don't know. But Coleman Hughes.
No, so I think it's important to say. I will say personally, on my behalf, with confidence, it's not racism now. that's doing that. It's not. It could have been racism up until 30 years ago or 20 years ago, but it's not racism now that's doing that. It may be vestigial from it, and I'm happy to concede any points that, the welfare state and redlining and other Jim Crow laws, like, crack versus cocaine, powder, that's all important. But I don't believe that in the past 20 years, the gap has been perpetuated by racism. And that's not to say, and this is all not to say that it's entirely incumbent on these lower class communities to fix themselves, because of course we should want more from our government. Of course we should. I think these communities are being failed by the current governments, but you shouldn't be totally reliant on the government to pull you out of the situation. There needs to be some autonomy there, some recognition that, maybe if we value education more and we value material goods like chains and cars less, and we encourage people to put money into the bank rather than spend it on clothes and sneakers, just stuff like that could make a difference. And then allow, the world to sort of catch up in regard to how much we care about the lower class, the working class, because I think we should care more about the working class, regardless of whatever the hell skin color they are. I don't want all brown-haired poor people to be helped. I want all poor people to be helped. And if it's disproportionately brown-haired people, then okay, fine, disproportionately brown-haired people got helped. But let's just focus on the thing let's not use a proxy, basically. If the problem is there are people in communities where there are economic problems and cultural problems, don't put a bedsheet over it and then use a proxy to gauge how you handle this. Look at it for what it is, figure out the thing you want to fix, which is the economic situation, and focus on fixing that. Don't go, oh, look, most of them are this, let's help these people. That's like a weird proxy that you're putting in between the thing you actually care about for no reason. You can get to the thing you actually care about without this intermediate step. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I've heard this. I've heard these arguments from Coleman Hughes and Thomas Sowell in particular. Who Coleman Hughes in that episode, with second part of the episode with Rubin Report, he basically talks about, he uses people from the West Indies as an example and the Caribbean islands. So as an example of when they move to America, they end up in the same neighborhoods and they're going to be subject to whatever levels of subjective or whatever levels of systemic racism is there. They're going to be subject to the same, but because he kind of breaks it down to, well, there's a selection bias because of the people that are able to get out of Jamaica and everything and get to the US. So there's maybe a selection bias there in terms of people that are more motivated, maybe, and then, but when they are there, that they're able to leave these areas and where there's a lot of trouble or there's a lot of poverty, and they're able to get out of there and their kids are going to college and everything. So, but I don't know what the research is, or where he's getting that data from. So for anyone who's interested, that might be worth looking into, because because again, but I think as a parting point, the failure of the left in America to do its actual job, I think, is the reason that there's basically been this big backlash against the Democrats, because they've abandoned their post as an actual counterbalance to conservative hierarchical structure and order and maintenance of this hierarchical competitive structure. And they've abandoned their post as the left typically should be there to take care of those that are dispossessed by hierarchical competitive structures. and to make sure that there are actual social supports for disability, and that there's people who are born into fucked up family situations have social support to be able to manage and to be able to try and level the playing field as best as possible as it relates to equality of opportunity. But they've abandoned that post and instead just become another party that just is subject to the will of these corporations instead of the Republicans that are subject to these corporations. And then there's no one actually taking care of those dispossessed. And then you have poor people all across America that are like, because I've been in 38 of the lower 48 states. I've seen unbelievable poverty in every skin color imaginable. I've seen people that if you told them they had white privilege, they'll be like, what the fuck? I live in a trailer, man. You know, I live in a trailer in fucking rural Indiana. My only job, my only options in life are to get a job in the petrol station if I can. Maybe if I'm lucky not to have some kind of a disability because I don't have any health care, I can maybe get a job in the army. Maybe if I don't have a disability because I have my parents are malnourished. I'm malnourished. I couldn't get health care. So like these are no options. And then they're getting told that they have white privilege because of this identity politics cover up by the Democrats as a result of they're covering up for their inability to do their actual job and abandoning their post. I think it's a very similar set of circumstances with Labour in the UK. So they got hammered by Tories because they're caught up in, they had Jeremy Corbyn, who from all appearances seemed like he was just a communist, anti-Semitic person, and there was a load of other identity politics nonsense going on. And instead of focusing on doing their job and helping to actually be a function as a thing that was able to act as a functional counterbalance, instead just getting caught up in identity politics games based on your religion or skin color or like it just like, what are we doing? Like, take care of poor people and try and level the playing field with equality of opportunity and stop talking about fucking identity characteristics.
Oh, dude, yeah, no, 100%. I'm so glad. I'm so glad to end on that because that was a beautiful point, beautifully made. I think that was also important what you're saying. And I feel we could do a whole extra conversation about that stuff because, yeah, there's so much to say there. I'm really glad you mentioned all of that because the failing of the left is worth bringing up, at least even briefly at the end. I don't necessarily know what this conversation was about.
Yeah.
But I'm so glad we had it, and I can't wait for other people to see it. I'll let you get off
together,
man.
well, man. Yeah, I have to go. I've got to go and do some meet some mates for some pull-ups and handstands in the park.
Nice.
And then go for a swim and then eat an Indian. That's my evening.
Oh, sounds good.
Yeah. I have 2 bags ready to go. I have 1 bag for a swim and 1 bag with a set of gymnastics rings and some training gear in it. And I'm about to go get a pump, go for a swim, eat a lash of rice. And
lovely, man.
Dal.
Enjoy it, dude.
Nice. Peace, buddy.
Take care, man.
Nice.